So, this is just one among many, many stories about the way in which the West overestimates itself and underestimates the rest of the world. And why is that so? I mean, look, I get it. It's part of it is we have a certain mental model about the way in which we see the world. And that's because we've been fed on a media diet of a particular kind of global stories, right? Which allow us to approach the world. So let's do a thought experiment. If I tell you to picture an African child, what comes to your mind? Just close your eyes, an African child. Maybe this, right? Or if I say, think about a city in India, maybe you'll think about this. Or if I say, hey, think about Mexico, but don't get lazy and think about tequilas and sombreros. Get beyond that. Maybe you've been binging on Narcos or The Queen of the South. So what this does is these media stories contribute to being baked into our imagination, which shapes the way we see the world, we act within the world, and we design policies and practices, right, to approach these worlds. So I'm not saying that these are not true stories. These are realities. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is it's a small part of a larger set of stories which just doesn't get told. Take the case of China, okay? So there are two dominant stories in the media, isn't it? It's like the US, China, trade wars, blah, blah, blah. And then the other is about Chinese authoritarianism. So there's another story, though, it's well worth telling, which is that China was one of the poorest countries in the world as far as in the late 1970s. And today, it is the second biggest economy in the world today, right? And what's really interesting is that they brought the largest number of poor people out of poverty in the shortest amount of time. Unprecedented. And here's another thing. They are the only country in the world today that has created a contender, a genuine contender to big tech in the United States, which is basically challenging the forces despite the fact that the US has extraordinary deep pockets, right? So what this message tells the world is, hey, you can also enter this game even though you have very limited resources, and not just compete, but you can become leaders of change. How is that not a story worth telling, right? So the global South, right, has changed significantly. It's not what it used to be. We've come far past the whole colonial narrative. We've become something. We, in a sense, I'm talking about 85% of the world's population that lives in these regions from, young people, by the way, are 90% of the world's population that live in these regions outside the West. That is the majority world. They live in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South Asia. And so we cannot afford to have singular, very reductionistic narratives about the majority world for just pure practical purposes. Forget altruism, right? So, I come from India. I was born and brought up in a place called Bangalore. And I actually went to convent school, which is why I sound like this. And I had these horrifying Irish nuns that I want to still kill. I think they're dead, though. But I would if I could. But anyway, and that's because there were not many schools, at that time, which were decent schools for us to go to. So, I went through the trauma of convent schools, but I was also a product of the, licensed Raj in India, which basically is, and this is, by the way, in the 70s and 80s, what this basically is that the government got to decide which companies got to sell which products and services at what prices under a limited permit system, okay? So that created high amounts of scarcity, very expensive pricing, long wait lines. In fact, it took us 11 years to get our first telephone connection. We had 3 television channels growing up, right? And a bike was a luxury good. So things have moved on, right? And the mobile internet today, when you look at the countries with the largest number of mobile, internet connections in terms, and the cheapest, because we're talking about a decade ago, it was some of the cheapest in the world, and today, the most expensive in the world, and today it's some of the cheapest in countries like India, Nigeria, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, right? Then you look at crypto and fintech, and who are the leaders? UAE and Vietnam and many others in the global south. In fact, Americans are still writing checks for the most part and using all kinds of chaotic, digital systems, and it's really each state, you go from state to state, and it's not really integrated. It really feels like, a decade behind, right? And then you have the India stack, which is a digital public infrastructure. And let me tell you why you should be really excited about this. So if you're a digital entrepreneur, okay, then you basically are, facing really high odds. Your margins are really slim. So you had to pay 20, 30% mafia tax to the likes of like Android, iOS, and it's really a black box. You don't know what you're really getting, right? You don't know how they're actually functioning and how transparent is it. But what the digital public infrastructure, the India stack, does is it allows any entrepreneur who wants to make their apps on an open source platform for free, right? And this basically is to create a counterforce against big tech. Basically, it's getting the market to work again, And, I'm part of the board of India's initiative with the Indian government has partnered with an unlikely actor called Proces in the Netherlands, which is basically a venture capital company which invests heavily in the emerging markets. So what I'm seeing here is these very unusual sort of alliances, which is fascinating and also hopeful, because what this is doing is that it is outside the United States, there are new forms of geopolitics that are trying to reshape the power politic, particularly when it comes to, data sovereignty. In fact, Europe is looking closely and working with Indian governments and companies right now to build their own Eurostack, to come up with an alternative, legitimate, and sustainable form of data sovereignty, particularly in these geopolitical times. And that is really worth being optimistic about, right? So, a couple of years ago, I wrote this Next Billion Users book, which is interesting because it basically captured about 2 decades of my work in the field. I'm a digital anthropologist, which is just a fancy way of saying that I study how young people look at digital media in their everyday lives and make sense of it, right? And I've spent 2 decades going to India, Brazil, Namibia, and many other parts of the global south, and we've been doing long-term projects in the field, on the ground, with many different stakeholders. And despite all the cultural differences, I can tell you confidently a couple of things, and that was really sort of the encapsulation of my book, is that young people are really optimistic about the digital futures, despite the harms and risks. And here is why. They are young. Do you remember? Maybe there's some of you who are younger than me for sure, but when you're young, you're just optimistic by nature because you have your life ahead of you, right? You can't get pessimistic about the way it plays out because you want to take control. And here's the thing, when you're young also, the digital allows them new forms of self-actualization, particularly in very conservative contexts, which is, by the way, majority of the world. When I was growing up in India, nobody talked to me about sex, sexuality, intimacy, not the schools, not my parents, not media. It basically doesn't exist. Only the West people do it, although we do have a population thing. But, maybe it's coming from the sky, the gods, So we don't talk to our kids, and so it is not a surprise that children and young adults are seeking for, answers to the big question as every teenager asks. Am I a freak? When I masturbate, or my pubic hair, or are my breasts supposed to look like this? This is the shit you ask, right, as a teenager. And guess what? The digital enables them, different kinds of communities, to feel like a sense of belonging across the world. It is no wonder they feel like a global citizen, unlike poll after poll that shows Europe and the United States feel less and less of a global citizen, even if the global South people never leave their village, their town, their context, they're connecting at visceral levels. Then you have this notion of, well, they want to do something about their life, and they don't want to do what their parents and their grandparents have been doing. They don't want to be farmers and herders. And I mean, the number of times I've worked with, UN agencies and other kinds of aid agencies. I sit on a number of these boards from UNDP, UNESCO, et cetera. And it's always about what are the jobs we can create for them. They're not asking us to create. They have a vision of what they want. No wonder they're leading the creator economy, right? They have a vision which is not going to be a replication, a reproduction of the past, and they're using digital tools to make that happen. And then we have the third dimension is, guess what? They want privacy, and they believe the digital will provide that. And this seems really counterintuitive, right? Because in Europe, it's like the digital is stealing our privacy. Books after books is, have we lost privacy? Is it a complete thing of the past? And let me give you a sort of context here. Picture yourself being a teenager in a favela in Brazil. You are living in a one-room home, okay, with 3 generations. You're sleeping with your parents, your grandparents, your uncle, some things, your siblings. You don't have physical privacy. And then you step out, neighbors are like, oh my God, did you see what she wore? In fact, I also used to go through that when I was a teenager in India. I'd step out and my parents are like, oh my God, are you wearing a short sleeve t-shirt? Like, well, who's gonna marry you, right? I mean, I'm like, yeah, hopefully not that person who doesn't want me to wear a short sleeve t-shirt. But anyway, so compared to their actual lives, the digital allows them a little more privacy. Think about a Bangladeshi worker, right, in Abu Dhabi or any of these other countries. They are sharing a room with 7 other workers in bunk beds after a 14-hour shift. So the only way they can humanize themselves is oftentimes through the digital, where they actually remind themselves through jokes, through community sharing, and that is considered in their own private and personal spaces. So in this sense, that it means something. What we're talking about here is that the digital becomes an extra pair of ears and eyes, and it basically allows them to self-actualize. So this has also generated a lot of optimism and play, because when you're online and you're optimistic and open-minded, then you tend to play with technologies. And when you play, a lot of good stuff happens, right? So if you've paid attention to what's going on in the global South, there are so many little startups coming up from India, in South Africa, in Abu Dhabi, and it's well worth considering what are they doing? Like, here are just 3 examples. Editrex basically is making, quality editing affordable for many of the young writers in the global South, and that's in India. Or if you want to look at Lilapa AI, it's a for Africa, by Africa, South African startup, which is really coming up with hyper-localized solutions to local problems. Or you see Angami, which is a radically new way of doing music streaming, which doesn't do world music, which is, well, what does that even mean, right? I love that genre, world music. But it basically is understanding that we need to think about creativity differently. And it's, in fact, doing a lot of experimenting, including it's the first platform to allow AI-generated music, but also it's using AI to detect creative ownership and establish much more fairer standards for provenance, which is one of the most important fights going on right now. Is creatives are asking, how do we get a fairer and more equitable sense of ownership, provenance, distribution? And so they're not just looking at AI as an enemy, but as a critical tool to enable that redistribution, because guess what? Majority of the countries, piracy is still the norm, right? And so they have to think out of the box. They have to think about added value. They can't attract musicians to contribute to the platforms if they don't do that. So this is basically the future of where music's going to be, not Spotify, right? And that's pretty damn exciting too. So these are the faces of the entrepreneurs, from Miru to, Eddie and Ellie and Jade and Peloni. That's the future of what entrepreneurship is going to look like. And, it's not a surprise that poll after poll also says that more than 9 out of 10 young people in Kenya, Mexico, China, Nigeria, and India are optimistic of the future, unlike those in Sweden, France, Australia, right? And if you look at about climate change, this is also so bizarre because we know that the global south is at the forefront and are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, particularly because they don't have the kinds of resources we do. They don't have the kinds of institution building. And yet, they're more optimistic because they see AI to become much more effective, efficient in resource management, like water management, identifying, how land is distributed. They're leveraging these tools to break the old systems that have not been serving them. So that is something really, really important. And then when we look at, surveys on how they believe AI can help with accessing information, treating disease, the way we learn, the way we work. Again, the global south are far more optimistic than that of the global north. And what we see in the meantime is, as we can see, The Economist already documented a article about why are Americans so sad, which basically seems so counterintuitive because it still is the wealthiest nation, right? And its GDP is high. Its jobs are, pretty high in number. And so there are many reasons why the Americans can be excited and happy. But it shows that a decade on, Americans are more depressed today than a decade ago. And about the digital futures, about their climate crisis, about democracy, about social life in general. I'm talking about it cuts across the spectrum, right? So what's going on? And this is also mirroring from, as I showed you about what's happening in Europe. Look, Europe and the United States remain still some of the wealthiest regions in the world today. They also, right? And I'm speaking for myself that is privileged, that I enjoy the kinds of freedoms that most of the world are, super envious about. While they're fighting for some basic freedoms, we do still enjoy a lot more freedom. Just look at us here. And so there's something else going on. What is it, right? Is it perhaps the loss of empire, right, that could do the trick, like Brexit saying, oh my God, we're going to become independent of Europe and ask all our Commonwealth countries to join forces because they like the mothership, right? No, it turns out they're like, screw you. Did you forget something? So, then is it maybe a loss of sort of, respect that perhaps you don't hold that position on the world stage as you used to? Like the US was such a strong economy to a point that it disproportionately, had the global economy in its pockets, right? Today, it's just about 35, 40%. And it's still a very, extraordinary force. But it's different now. Many wealthier countries, you can even hear China say, you know what? We can ride this tariff war. Why? Because there are many other countries that can buy our goods and services. Times have changed, right? Or is it, the loss of control? That you feel like, oh my God, the fortress Europe is just breaking down, and what's going to happen? Because there's this fear of the unknown, right? There's a fear driven by the kinds of stories we tell and the stories we hear. But I can tell a counter story. I can tell a story of, hey, guess what? Immigrants are upholding the institutions that you've come to love and you see as very much part of your identity, right? Or I could tell the story that, hey, guess what, Americans? You talk a lot about innovation, but 36% of your entire patents are generated by foreigners. Do you want to let that go? Do you want to recognize that? Or I could tell a story of, well, EU, stop looking inward looking. I'm living in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and the Dutch are building large language models, but guess what? For Dutch, by Dutch. They are in this inward looking spiral too, because there's this, God forbid, the foreigners are taking away jobs and ruining the Dutch culture, right? But I would be doing the same exact bullshit. I'd be telling you a singular and opposite narrative, all right? So what we need is really a change, and this is why I wrote the book. I wrote a book, From Pessimism to Promise, particularly documenting, the many, many lessons I have learned over the last few decades from Global South people, entrepreneurs, companies like Random Walk AI. And what's really crazy is every time I go to India or Nigeria, or I travel to South Africa, and I am on fire. I feel it. It's contagious because they are super excited. They are able to do things differently. My cousin sister she does this gets a lot of outsourcing. She's in a media production in Delhi. And I said, how do you feel about AI? And she's like, oh, I'm super scared, but I'm super excited because, the world holds it against us that we have the Indian accent. So it takes so much money and resources to train my staff to get the right American accent or the British accent. Now AI just does that. And we can focus more on content. I can do quality content for the same amount of money. So, but she's still afraid. But there's no time to be afraid because they are the forefront to be replaced, or they just have to think differently, and they are. Because they're seeing opportunities, and we've got to do that too. Because look, the bottom line is we cannot afford the binary thinking, us versus them, the global north versus the south, is AI good or bad? It's just exhausting because it doesn't lead us to any productive futures, right? Because we need all hands of deck to get and confront the problems we face today, which are intrinsically global in nature, the climate crisis, inequality, the future of work, peace, right? We cannot let inclusion be a do-good thing. It is just common sense, right? And despite the long list of words that are banned in the US right now, socially banned, saying, oh, you shouldn't use inclusion, gender, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the rest of the world are like, come on, this is just common sense. I want tools that work and say gender, that's half the world's population. If I'm not looking at women and catering and my products are not functioning for them, then somebody else will design that. And I will lose that market. I don't mind that kind of thinking because you know what? It's honest. It looks at them as a legitimate market, which means there's consumer rights and accountability. That's a start. So all I'm saying is that we need to pay attention. We need to come together and just absorb some of that optimism from the global south because we need to go together to face the future. And I do believe that future is bright. So yeah, thank you very much. And I hope you join the conversation.